120 guests stood under the glass roof. My sister smiled, pointing at me. This is my sister. She works in crisis intervention, so if anyone gets emotional, we are covered. My parents laughed first. A rehearsed sound. I stood in my dark blue dress, ready to swallow the humiliation, but the groom did not laugh. Reid Ashford stared at the silver ring on my hand, a memory buried for 2 years awakening at his own wedding. My name is Peyton Fitzgerald, and I am 32 years old. I arrived at Merewood Hall early, long before the sun had a chance to burn through the morning fog and warm the heavy, ivy-covered stone walls of the estate. The air inside the grand ballroom was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling faintly of imported white lilies, expensive floor wax, and the subtle, metallic scent of nervous anticipation. Yet, despite the vastness of the vaulted glass ceiling above, the atmosphere felt entirely devoid of oxygen. It was suffocating. I found my assigned seat not at the sprawling family table draped in heavy ivory silk at the absolute center of the room, but tucked away in the darkest back corner, table 24. It was positioned so close to the swinging doors of the staff entrance that I could hear the constant clatter of silverware, the hissing of espresso machines, and the hushed, urgent curses of the catering team trying to keep up with the impossible schedule. That was exactly where my family wanted me, out of sight, out of the carefully curated frame, and far away from anyone who mattered. My younger sister, Sloane Fitzgerald, was not merely hosting a wedding today. She was executing a flawless corporate merger, a grand theatrical unveiling of her meticulously crafted personal brand. Every single detail in the room, from the exact, color-matched shade of the cloth napkins to the measured, synchronized smiles of the hired string quartet, was calculated for maximum social impact and photographic perfection. She moved through the sea of arriving guests in her custom designer gown, looking less like a woman about to swear eternal love and more like a ruthless executive surveying her newly acquired, highly profitable assets. There was no genuine warmth here, no trembling hands or teary-eyed joy, only pure, unfiltered strategy. She stopped at designated, well-lit points across the pristine marble floor, striking poses that felt as though they had been rehearsed in front of a full-length mirror for weeks. I watched her from my secluded, dimly lit corner, sipping a glass of lukewarm tap water, feeling exactly like a trespasser crashing a highly exclusive, heavily guarded gala. Then came the pre-ceremony welcome, an event Sloane had insisted upon to ensure all eyes were properly fixed on her before the actual vows began. The string quartet faded their stringed instruments into a soft, polite hum. Sloane stood gracefully on the low marble platform at the front of the room, gripping a slim, silver-plated microphone. She smiled, a bright, blinding flash of perfectly white teeth. She smoothly thanked the wealthy patrons who had traveled far, acknowledged the deep, generational prestige of the Ashford family, and painted a glowing, entirely fictionalized picture of our own family that belonged on the cover of a glossy, high-end lifestyle magazine. And then, without any warning, her eyes swept across the crowded room, bypassing the front rows of important dignitaries and landing directly on my shadowed corner. The microphone amplified her velvet, practiced voice, bouncing it off the high glass walls. And of course, we have my sister, Peyton, sitting all the way back there by the kitchens, Sloane announced. Her tone was dripping with a sweet, honeyed sarcasm that only I was truly meant to decode, disguised perfectly as affectionate teasing to the untrained ear. She works in crisis intervention. You know, talking people off ledges, dealing with breakdowns, and managing people who just cannot hold it together. So, if anyone gets a little too emotional or has a very public, messy meltdown today, do not worry at all. At least our family had the foresight to bring someone to handle the mess. The silence that followed her statement lasted only a fraction of a second before the laughter broke it, shattering the quiet tension. My father, Gerald, and my mother, Monica, laughed first. Their laughter was not the spontaneous, joyful sound of genuine amusement. It was the loud, polished, aggressively practiced bark of people validating a joke to ensure everyone else in the room knew they were supposed to find it funny. It was a desperate cue. Hearing my parents, the remaining 120 guests joined in. The sound rippled through the grand hall, a polite, reflexive chuckle echoing from people in expensive tailored suits and custom silk dresses who did not know me at all, but who knew enough about social survival to side with the bride on her wedding day. I did not smile. I did not nod in polite submission. I did not look away, nor did I shift my gaze to the intricate patterns on the floor. I just stood there beside my chair in my simple dark blue dress, my face perfectly and completely blank, looking straight back at Sloane. I let the silence stretch entirely from my end. I refused to give them the easy comfort of my own self-deprecation. My absolute, unflinching stillness acted like a giant mirror, reflecting the sheer cruelty and ugliness of the moment back at the entire room. Slowly, the ripples of laughter began to die down, faltering into an uncomfortable murmur. The air in the room grew thick, heavy, and distinctly unpleasant. Several guests sitting near my table shifted awkwardly in their velvet seats, exchanging nervous glances, suddenly realizing the joke was not a lighthearted sibling jab, but a deliberate, public execution. The forced amusement morphed rapidly into a palpable, crawling discomfort that coated the room. Amidst the fading chuckles and the sudden, tense chorus of throat clearing, I noticed that one specific person had not laughed at all. The groom. Reid Ashford stood a few feet behind Sloane on the marble platform, his tall frame rigid and completely still. When Sloane had delivered her punchline, his polite, accommodating smile had vanished entirely from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. But it was not the insult itself that had caught him. It was the mention of my job, my presence, and then the sudden, violent collision of a memory he had kept deeply buried. As the room settled into its uneasy, stifling quiet, his eyes locked onto me across the vast sea of heads. He stared with an intensity that was physically jarring. He looked exactly like a man who had just been forcefully struck by a ghost from a past life. His chest stopped moving. He froze completely, his gaze dropping momentarily to my hands resting on the edge of the table, searching for something specific. I knew what he was looking for, even from this immense distance. He was putting the fragmented pieces together, experiencing a violent, terrifying collision of his darkest, most desperate night and what was supposed to be his brightest day. Standing just a few feet away from him, his mother, Reid Ashford, missed absolutely nothing. She was a formidable woman built entirely of old money, ruthless observation, and sharp, unforgiving instincts. I saw her narrow, calculating eyes flick rapidly from Sloane's smug, satisfied expression to her own son's pale, visibly stricken face. Finally, her gaze followed his direct line of sight, cutting through the crowd to land squarely on me. Eleanor's posture straightened imperceptibly. She studied me from across the vast room, her expression completely unreadable, but I knew without a doubt she was logging every single detail of my appearance and my demeanor. She knew something was profoundly, dangerously wrong, and she knew it centered entirely on the quiet, unsmiling woman her future daughter-in-law had just tried to publicly humiliate. The wedding coordinator gestured frantically from the sidelines, waving a silver clipboard to signal that the formal procession needed to begin immediately. Sloane turned around, her perfect, practiced smile snapping right back into place, entirely oblivious to the massive seismic shift that had just occurred directly behind her back. Reid did not immediately follow her gaze or her movement. He lingered for one more heavy, agonizing second. He leaned slightly to his left, closing the distance toward his best man. The room was just quiet enough, and my hyper-vigilant focus was sharp enough that I could read the exact shape of the words as they formed and left his lips. I know her from somewhere. For sure. Exactly 60 days before the grand spectacle at the Ashford estate, the postal worker dropped a heavy cream-colored envelope into my rusted metal mailbox. The envelope was crafted from thick, artisanal cotton paper that felt remarkably like expensive linen beneath my fingertips. The calligraphy flowing across the front was elegant, sweeping, and completely devoid of any personal warmth or familiarity. It was addressed to Peyton Fitzgerald. They had spelled my given name wrong. To a stranger, it might have looked like a simple, forgivable typographical error, just a single vowel out of place. But to me, it was a glaring, deliberate testament to my actual position within their lives. I broke the stiff wax seal to find a deeply impersonal, highly formalized card. There was no handwritten note tucked inside, no small message asking how my week had been, and notably, no option provided to bring a guest. I was allotted one single, solitary seat. I was not being invited as a beloved family member to share in a joyous union. I was being summoned as a mandatory, albeit entirely unwelcome, social obligation. To truly understand how my family reached this dizzying pinnacle of hollow luxury, one had to look backward to a time when our lives were grounded in mundane reality. My parents, Gerald and Monica, were not born into the elite, fortified social circles they now so desperately clawed to inhabit. For a long, unremarkable period of time, they owned a modest, moderately successful chain of Midwestern furniture stores. We were comfortable, middle class, and utterly normal. Our lives smelled of fresh pine, leather polish, and honest labor. But then came a disastrous commercial loan expansion, followed immediately by a sudden economic downturn, leading to a brutal, unforgiving bankruptcy. The banks took the sprawling storefronts, the warehouse inventory, and the comfortable illusion of our financial security. That catastrophic ruin did not humble my parents. It completely broke their psychological foundation. The profound loss of their business bred a deep, venomous shame within them. To cope with the harsh reality of being entirely broke, they developed a rabid, consuming obsession with the illusion of high-class status. If they could not possess actual wealth, they would dedicate every waking second of their remaining lives to looking as though they were dripping in it. My younger sister, Sloane, recognized this deep, festering psychological fracture in our parents and weaponized it beautifully for her own gain. As a highly paid professional brand image consultant, Sloane made a lucrative living telling insecure corporate executives how to lie convincingly to the general public. She seamlessly applied those exact same ruthless corporate public relations strategies to our own bloodline. She became the absolute, unquestioned director of the Fitzgerald family production. When Sloane decided to target the vast Ashford family wealth for her marital ambitions, she knew perfectly well that a bankrupt furniture salesman and his equally disgraced wife would never pass the rigorous social background checks of old money elitists. So, she simply rewrote our entire history. She dictated their wardrobes, forcing my parents to abandon their comfortable clothes in favor of muted, incredibly expensive-looking earth tones and tailored cashmere. She taught them to speak in low, measured volumes about abstract, sophisticated concepts. In the glittering narrative Sloane sold to the Ashford family, my parents were never financial failures who lost everything to a bank auditor. Instead, they were entirely rebranded as discreet collectors of fine art and rare antiquities, people possessing a taste so refined and elevated that they simply chose to live a quiet, understated life away from the vulgarity of new, flashy money. They played their assigned parts flawlessly, but every theatrical stage production has a glaring flaw, and I was theirs. I did not fit into Sloane's immaculate, carefully curated aesthetic vision. My very existence was a massive liability to her campaign of deception. As a mobile crisis intervention specialist, my daily life possessed absolutely zero glamour. My world operated in the gritty shadows, entirely devoid of the polished gloss my family actively worshipped. My career consisted of grueling, relentless night shifts, driving a battered crisis response vehicle through the bleakest, most dangerous neighborhoods in the city. My clients were not wealthy socialites, trading idle gossip over high tea. They were profoundly panicked individuals whose lives were violently shattering in real time. My uniform frequently smelled of stale hospital waiting rooms, cheap industrial coffee, and the cold, unmistakable sweat of human terror. While Sloane was busy coordinating matching pastel linens for a yacht party, I was sitting on cold kitchen floors at 2 in the morning, trying to convince a terrified teenager to drop a weapon or talking a desperate soul away from a ledge. There is absolutely no way to put a high society spin on the metallic smell of dried blood or the sound of genuine, guttural weeping. Because my reality was so violently at odds with their fiction, I was slowly, methodically erased from the family portrait. I was kept far away from the rehearsal dinners, the country club tours, and the introductory meetings with the Ashford patriarchs. I naturally assumed my wedding invitation was merely a cold formality, something they desperately hoped I would politely decline. Then, my mother called. Monica did not ask if I was healthy, or if my grueling 12-hour shifts were exhausting me. Her voice came through the receiver crisp, cold, and entirely transactional. She firmly informed me that my attendance at the ceremony was absolutely mandatory. Her reasoning was not born out of a mother's warm desire to have her eldest daughter present on a major family milestone day. She stated, with chilling business-like clarity, that the wedding photographer required perfectly balanced symmetry for the wide-angle group shots. The family simply could not have an empty, unexplained space in the official archival photographs. I was not a sister or a daughter to them anymore. I was a prop. I was a physical object strictly required to fill a geometric void, so Sloane's visual narrative would remain perfectly unbroken. I hung up the phone that evening feeling a familiar, hollow ache expanding in my chest. I sat alone at my small, scratched kitchen table, staring blankly at the misspelled invitation, fully intending to throw the thick paper straight into the trash can. The mere thought of sitting quietly in a room full of wealthy strangers, pretending to belong to a family that actively despised my reality, felt like a slow, deliberate form of psychological torture. The very next night, during a rare, quiet moment on the midnight shift, I showed the pristine invitation to my closest colleague, Tessa Monroe. Tessa was a hardened, fiercely intelligent woman who had seen the absolute worst of humanity and had absolutely zero patience for polite social illusions. She sat across from me in the sterile break room, bathed in the flickering fluorescent lights, and listened quietly as I explained the ridiculous wardrobe demands, the elaborate lies, and my firm intention to simply stay home and let them have their perfect, fake day without me. Tessa slowly set her styrofoam coffee cup down, looked me dead in the eyes, and shook her head with absolute certainty. She told me that hiding in the shadows was exactly what Sloane was banking on. Tessa warned me that if I voluntarily disappeared, I would hand my sister the ultimate, uncontested victory. My absence would give Sloane the unchecked power to dictate my entire life narrative to the Ashfords and to the rest of the world without any fear of contradiction. She could invent any lie, construct any narrative, and paint me in whatever chaotic, unstable colors served her grand design best. If I was not there to stand as a living, breathing counter-argument, Sloane's fabricated, toxic version of me would become the undeniable truth. Staring at the harsh lights of the break room, I realized Tessa was completely right. My family had already aggressively stripped me of my history, my dignity, and even my given name on that heavy cream paper. I decided right then to send the response card back, deliberately checking the box confirming my solitary attendance. I did not buy the dark blue dress and agree to sit in the shadows because I harbored some pathetic, lingering hope that my parents would suddenly look at me with genuine love or sudden pride. I accepted the invitation because I needed to look them directly in the eye. I went because, for the first time in my entire life, I wanted to sit quietly in the room and witness exactly what kind of monstrous fiction my own family had turned me into just to secure a wealthy crown. Blue Haven Crisis Response was not a place of polished surfaces, curated lighting, or forced, polite smiles. It was a mobile, entirely fictionalized field unit operating in the raw, unedited, and often brutal margins of the city. We were the people dispatched by emergency operators when a situation was far too delicate for the armed presence of the police, yet far too immediate and volatile for a scheduled, comfortable therapy session. My sanctuary was not a leather chair in a corner office. It was the cramped, utilitarian passenger seat of a heavily modified response van. I spent my life surrounded by the heavy canvas of trauma medical kits, the relentless static crackle of the dispatch radio, and the lingering, metallic scent of stale rain and nervous adrenaline. This chaotic, unpredictable environment was my actual domain. This was the singular place on Earth where my presence held a measurable, undeniable value. There was absolutely nothing glamorous or socially prestigious about my daily existence. My work did not take place in sterile, softly lit clinical environments with soothing music playing in the background. My reality happened out in the freezing, biting wind of a concrete highway overpass, standing just inches away from a military veteran whose mind was violently trapped in a combat zone from a decade ago, utterly unable to find his way back to the present moment. It happened sitting cross-legged on the sticky, unwashed linoleum of a cramped university apartment kitchen, quietly and steadily matching my breathing to a terrified college student who was hyperventilating so hard her hands had cramped into tight, unyielding claws. It happened in the shattered, chaotic living rooms of affluent suburban homes, acting as a physical and emotional barrier between warring family members, absorbing their radiating fury, and transforming it into something manageable before it turned fatal. Within our response team, I had managed to carve out a very distinct reputation. I was never the loudest voice on the chaotic scene, nor was I the one to rush in with aggressive textbook commands or forced authority. My particular specialized skill lay in the rare, difficult art of subtraction. I knew exactly how to strip away the noise, the rising panic, and the overwhelming sensory overload of a severe psychological crisis. I understood that true de-escalation rarely involves dictating orders to someone. It involves giving them the absolute, unconditional permission to feel their sheer terror without an ounce of judgment. I knew the precise, fleeting moment to offer a quiet, steadying phrase, and far more importantly, I knew exactly when to simply shut my mouth and sit beside someone in the suffocating darkness, letting my silent, unmoving presence serve as a solid anchor. It was a quiet, entirely unassuming method, but it was highly effective. It worked so remarkably well that our clinical director, Dr. Nora Bell, had called me into her cramped, fiercely disorganized office just 3 weeks prior to the wedding. Dr. Bell was a pragmatic, fiercely intelligent woman who had seen decades of trauma and absolutely never handed out empty praise. She sat behind a heavy oak desk completely buried under thick manila case files, removed her reading glasses, and told me in her blunt, straightforward manner that she was officially submitting my name for an internal, highly prestigious organization award honoring exceptional field leadership. She spoke at length about my consistently high case resolution rates, my unflappable demeanor under extreme, life-threatening duress, and my unique capacity to absorb immense human suffering without letting it rot my own core. Hearing her words should have been a moment of profound, unadulterated triumph. It was a concrete, undeniable validation of my entire professional existence and the countless sleepless nights I had endured. Yet, as I sat in that cramped office listening to her praise, a heavy, familiar stone of sorrow settled deep in the pit of my stomach. I thanked her graciously, of course, but I knew instantly and with absolute certainty that I would never, under any circumstances, share this incredible news with my family. I had learned that painful, humiliating lesson a long time ago. I vividly recalled the very last time I had foolishly attempted to bridge the gaping, silent chasm between my gritty reality and their carefully constructed, wealthy fantasy. It was during a rare, incredibly tense holiday dinner at my parents' newly acquired, heavily mortgaged estate. I had just come off a grueling 48-hour rotation and had successfully talked a desperate, grieving mother into handing over a lethal bottle of prescription pills, seeking just a tiny sliver of familial connection. I cautiously shared a heavily sanitized, gentle version of the story over the expensive roasted duck. Sloane had paused, her crystal wine glass hovering midway to her perfectly painted lips. She had looked at me with a sickening mixture of profound pity and utter, unfiltered disdain. She let out a sharp, ringing laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling and asked the entire table if sitting around talking to sad strangers actually counted as a real respectable profession in the modern corporate world. My father, Gerald, had not offered a single word of defense. He had simply stared down at his expensive porcelain plate, gripping his silver steak knife with white-knuckled intensity, completely avoiding my eyes. Gerald worshipped tangible, immediate, financial success. He worshipped luxury cars, real estate portfolios, and things that could be officially appraised, insured, and showcased to other wealthy, influential men. The quiet, invisible discipline required to save a human mind from the brink of destruction held absolutely zero currency in his shallow world. My demanding work made him profoundly uncomfortable because raw kindness, empathy, and crisis intervention could not be instantly converted into social capital or a high-yield stock portfolio. To him, my career was not a calling. It was just a confusing, embarrassing, low-paying hobby that I stubbornly refused to outgrow. So, I kept my two completely different worlds forcefully severed. Whenever the suffocating weight of my family's relentless rejection threatened to crack my composure, I relied heavily on a singular physical grounding mechanism. I always wore a heavily tarnished silver ring on the index finger of my right hand. It was shaped exactly like an old-fashioned sewing thimble, covered entirely in tiny, meticulous, dimpled indentations. It was the only physical object I possessed in the entire world that had belonged to my biological mother, a woman who had vanished from my life long before Sloane and her polished mother had arrived to construct their pristine plastic empire. The ring was not valuable in any traditional, monetary sense. It was battered, slightly misshapen from years of wear, and lacked any flashy precious stones. But to me, that small piece of metal was a lifeline. During the most volatile, unpredictable moments of a violent crisis call, or during the agonizing, silent holiday dinners with my father, my thumb would instinctively find that ring. I would slowly, methodically trace the rough, textured pattern of the silver dimples. The sharp, grounding, tactile sensation would instantly slice through the rising, paralyzing tide of my anxiety, forcefully pulling my scattered, racing consciousness directly back into my physical body. It was a quiet, invisible ritual of endurance that kept me sane. That silver thimble ring was a permanent fixture on my hand, essentially a part of my very anatomy. I never, under any circumstances, took it off. Except for one singular, extraordinary, terrifying night. The memory of that specific shift always hovered just beneath the surface of my daily thoughts, a persistent ghost that absolutely refused to be fully exorcised by time or logic. Exactly 2 years ago, I was abruptly dispatched to a high-risk, volatile scenario that ended up breaking every single one of my strict internal protocols. It was a desperate call that had burrowed so deeply into my psyche that it haunted my quiet, solitary moments far longer and far more intensely than any other case in my entire career. I had spent agonizing hours in the freezing, relentless, punishing rain, pouring every single ounce of my soul, my energy, and my sanity into keeping a complete stranger tethered to the physical world of the living. I had surrendered my only protective anchor that night. I had walked away from the desolate concrete scene feeling cold, profoundly exhausted, and fundamentally changed, carrying the crushing, silent weight of a life saved by the absolute narrowest of margins. And the most haunting, deeply unsettling detail of all was that, despite the profound, life-altering intimacy of that brutal night on the ledge, I had never even learned the desperate man's name. Exactly 72 hours before the grand ceremony at Muirwood Hall, the formal introductions took place at the Ashford family estate on the lake. The property was a sprawling compound of dark mahogany and native stone, entirely secluded by acres of ancient pine trees. It was the kind of generational wealth that did not need to shout or demand attention. The water lapping gently against the private wooden dock provided a serene background track to the clinking of crystal glasses. There were perhaps 4 dozen guests scattered across the manicured lawn, a highly curated mix of relatives and vital corporate allies. I stood near a massive stone fire pit, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching my sister conduct her masterpiece. Sloane glided across the polished hardwood of the expansive outdoor terrace. Her arm linked elegantly with Reid. She was actively introducing Gerald and Monica to a circle of Ashford patriarchs and matriarchs. I could hear the practiced cadence of her voice carrying over the gentle evening breeze. She deployed the entirely fabricated version of our family history with terrifying ease. She spoke of our parents' supposed extensive travels, their refined eye for obscure European antiques, and their deep philosophical appreciation for a quiet, secluded lifestyle. She painted them as eccentric aristocrats who simply preferred the shadows to the spotlight. My parents nodded along, their faces fixed in expressions of modest, wealthy humility. They played their roles so perfectly that, for a brief, disorienting second, I almost believed them myself. Then, the inevitable rotation of the social circle brought them directly to where I was standing. The polite, expectant gaze of the Ashford family shifted to me. Sloane did not miss a single beat. Her smile remained a brilliant, unyielding shield as she gestured loosely in my direction. She did not use my formal title. She did not mention the grueling training, the late nights, or the lives pulled back from the brink. Instead, she offered a dismissive, airy wave of her manicured hand and told the gathered elite that I did some vague work around the social sector. Before the final syllable had even fully left her mouth, she pivoted sharply, smoothly steering the conversation toward the intricate floral arrangements and the imported porcelain plates selected for the reception dinner. It was a masterful, lightning-fast redirection, designed to render me entirely invisible. However, Eleanor Ashford did not follow the verbal detour. The groom's mother possessed a sharp, discerning intellect that seemed entirely immune to Sloane's superficial charms. Eleanor stepped slightly away from the group discussing hydrangeas and turned her full, undivided attention directly toward me. Her gaze was piercing, analytical, and surprisingly warm. She asked me, directly and clearly, what specific sector of social work I was involved in, noting that her own family engaged in various philanthropic endeavors. I opened my mouth to answer, to finally speak a single sentence of truth into the stifling, manicured air. Before I could draw the breath to form the words, Monica materialized at my side. My mother inserted herself smoothly between Eleanor and me, her face stretched into a tight, agonizingly fake smile. She placed a cold, heavily ringed hand on my forearm, her fingers digging painfully into my skin through the fabric of my dress. With a light, musical laugh that sounded like breaking glass, Monica told Eleanor that I simply did not like to talk about my job outside of working hours. She claimed my work was terribly draining and that today was strictly about celebrating joyous things, not dwelling on the depressing elements of society. She effectively sealed my mouth shut, trapping my voice behind a wall of manufactured maternal concern. Eleanor politely conceded, but her eyes narrowed slightly, logging the unnatural tension radiating from my mother's rigid posture. Standing there in the fading twilight, a cold realization settled deep within my bones. Sloane and my parents did not merely want to hide me in the background. Hiding me was passive. What they were doing was entirely active. They were executing a calculated, aggressive campaign to control the entire narrative surrounding my existence. They needed to dictate exactly how these wealthy, influential strangers perceived me, ensuring I remained a dull, uninteresting blur on the periphery of their shining canvas. If anyone looked too closely, the entire fragile facade of the Fitzgerald dynasty would shatter. Seeking a momentary escape from the suffocating social theater, I retreated toward the shadowy wrap-around porch at the back of the massive house. The air here smelled heavily of damp earth and pine needles. I stood near an open set of French doors, letting the cool breeze wash over my face. I was entirely alone for only a few minutes before I heard the distinct, urgent clicking of heels on the wooden floorboards inside. It was Monica and Sloane. They were standing just inside the darkened study, completely unaware that the open windows carried their hushed, venomous voices directly out into the night air. I stood frozen against the stone siding, listening as my mother delivered strict tactical instructions to my sister. Monica's voice was stripped of all its earlier musical warmth. It was sharp, brittle, and commanding. She explicitly ordered Sloane to make absolutely certain that I was kept far away from the major financial donors and the key corporate investors during the remainder of the weekend. Her exact reasoning cut through the quiet night like a serrated blade. She stated that rich people simply did not want to be subjected to the depressing smell of hospitals and human crisis. She called my life a miserable, bleeding heart crusade that had absolutely no place mingling with people of actual consequence. The sheer cruelty of the statement hit me, but it did not surprise me. I waited for them to move along, but Sloane lingered in the study. A few moments later, a pair of her hand-picked, aggressively cheerful bridesmaids entered the room, carrying crystal flutes of champagne. They giggled about the seating charts and the handsome groomsmen. One of them casually asked Sloane why I was acting so quiet and withdrawn throughout the evening, noting that I seemed entirely disconnected from the celebratory mood. I held my breath, waiting for the standard lie about my grueling schedule or my natural introversion. Instead, Sloane dropped a narrative bomb that made my blood run entirely cold. With a voice dripping in manufactured pity and hushed confidentiality, Sloane told her friends that she had confidentially warned the Ashford family about my mental state. She fabricated a detailed, elaborate lie, claiming that I had recently gone through a severe period of emotional instability. She told them I was incredibly fragile, prone to unpredictable outbursts, and fundamentally broken. She instructed the bridesmaids, and by extension, anyone else they gossiped with, not to ask me too many direct questions or engage me in deep conversations, framing it as an act of necessary caution to protect my supposedly delicate sanity. My hands curled into tight fists at my sides. This was not a simple social slight. This was not a passive attempt to make me look uninteresting. This was deliberate, malicious slander. She was weaponizing the very concept of mental health to neutralize me. By labeling me as emotionally unstable, she systematically discredited any truth I might accidentally speak. If I tried to expose their lies, if I tried to defend my career or my reality, I would simply look exactly like the crazy, jealous sister she had preemptively warned everyone about. It was a flawless, sociopathic trap. She was turning me into a person who needed to be managed, supervised, and ultimately ignored. I pressed my back harder against the rough stone wall, the anger burning hot and bright in my chest. I needed to leave that porch before I walked into that study and tore down the entire charade with my bare hands. I turned to slip quietly away down the wooden steps, moving back toward the darker edge of the lawn. As I rounded the heavy wooden pillar at the corner of the porch, I abruptly stopped, standing perfectly still in the deep shadows. Just a few feet away from the open French doors was Reid. He was holding 2 glasses of whiskey, his face completely illuminated by a stray beam of light cutting through the window. He was staring directly at the study, where Sloane and her bridesmaids were still whispering. He had not been there long enough to hear the conversation with my mother about the hospital smells. He had not heard the entire calculated setup, but based on the rigid tension in his jaw and the complete absence of any warmth in his eyes, he had heard the very end of it. He had heard the woman he was about to marry gleefully describing her own flesh and blood as a broken, unstable liability to a room full of giggling strangers. Reid slowly turned his head and locked eyes with me in the darkness. We did not exchange a single word. We did not need to. The silence stretching between us was heavy with the sudden, shocking weight of a terrible revelation. He looked back toward the glowing window, the whiskey glasses trembling ever so slightly in his hands. He did not possess the full picture yet, but as I walked silently away into the cool night, I knew that the very first, fatal seed of doubt had just been planted deep within the groom's mind concerning the true nature of the woman he was scheduled to marry. Exactly 26 months prior to standing beneath the suffocating, climate-controlled glass ceiling of Merewood Hall, my world was defined by the relentless, freezing assault of a late November storm. It was a Tuesday, deep into a grueling night shift, when the dispatch radio bolted firmly to the dashboard of my response vehicle cracked the heavy silence. The call came through precisely at 2 a.m. The operator voice was clipped, entirely devoid of the usual bureaucratic drone, signaling an immediate, high-priority crisis. The location was the Briar Square parking deck, a towering, brutalist structure of raw concrete and steel located in the heart of the financial district. The specifics were brutally brief. A male subject, appearing to be in his late 30s, wearing a dark tailored suit, was currently standing on the wrong side of the reinforced security barrier on the absolute highest level of the structure. I drove through the desolate, flooded city streets, the heavy tires of the van slicing through deep standing water, while the windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the torrential downpour. When I finally reached the exposed top floor, the scene was a chaotic, fractured mosaic of spinning red and blue emergency lights reflecting off the expansive, oily black puddles. A tactical unit of 4 police cruisers had formed a jagged, makeshift barricade near the entrance ramp, their engines idling loudly in the storm. The officers were standing behind their open doors, their heavy raincoats slick with water, completely unsure of how to proceed without triggering a fatal outcome. I stepped out of my vehicle and into the freezing deluge, the icy water instantly soaking through the thin fabric of my uniform jacket. I immediately sought out the commanding officer on the scene and delivered my standard, entirely non-negotiable directive. I told him to pull every single officer back down the concrete ramp. I demanded they extinguish the blinding spotlights and silence the spinning sirens immediately. When a human mind has fractured so severely that a person is actively standing on a ledge, cornering them with an audience of armed, uniformed men only serves as a massive, terrifying catalyst. It triggers a primal, defensive panic that almost always guarantees a tragic, irreversible leap. I needed the environment to be completely empty, submerged in darkness, and entirely stripped of aggressive authority. Reluctantly, the commander gave the order, and the heavy cruisers slowly reversed down the ramp, leaving me completely alone in the storm with a desperate stranger. I turned and began to walk slowly across the vast, waterlogged expanse of the rooftop. The wind was howling violently, whipping across the exposed concrete and carrying the sharp metallic scent of ozone mixed with the heavy, lingering exhaust fumes from the lower parking levels. He was standing on a terribly narrow, slippery lip of wet cement, his fingers curled tightly through the gaps of the heavy chain-link fencing that extended just above the primary barrier. His expensive dark suit was completely plastered to his shivering frame, ruined by the relentless rain. He was staring straight down into the dizzying black abyss of the street below, his posture rigid with a terrible, absolute finality. I stopped my approach exactly 10 paces away from him. I did not announce my presence with a booming voice or a heavy megaphone. I did not insult his profound agony by shouting empty textbook promises about how life was inherently beautiful or how the morning sun would inevitably make everything better. Those hollow, cheerful platitudes are completely useless to a person who has already emotionally checked out of the world. Instead, I slowly, deliberately, sat down on the freezing, rough cement floor. I sat cross-legged directly in a shallow puddle, intentionally making my physical presence smaller, lower, and entirely non-threatening. I let the freezing rain beat down on my shoulders, sharing the exact same miserable, punishing environment he was enduring. For a long, agonizing stretch of time, the only sound on the roof was the violent, rhythmic drumming of the storm against the metal structures. Finally, he spoke. His voice was incredibly raw, entirely stripped of its natural resonance, breaking into jagged, breathless fragments. He spoke to the dark air, not directly to me. He whispered that he simply could not see a single path forward anymore. He murmured that the crushing pressure inside his chest was too immense, the noise in his head entirely too loud to survive another sunrise. He stated, with a terrifying, seductive calmness, that if he just allowed himself to stay perfectly quiet for a few more seconds, if he just let his exhausted fingers slip from the wet metal fence, all the agonizing noise would finally stop. He was entirely consumed by the profound, blinding logic of absolute despair. I did not argue with his bleak assessment. Arguing validates the internal debate, and a freezing concrete ledge is absolutely no place to engage in a debate. Instead, my singular goal was to slowly, methodically build a quiet bridge of sensory details to pull his fractured consciousness directly back into his physical body. I kept my voice incredibly low and remarkably steady, projecting it just enough to slice cleanly through the howling wind. I started talking about the immediate, undeniable reality of the physical world surrounding us. I softly pointed out the distinct, hollow pinging sound the heavy rain made as it struck the large aluminum electrical box situated near my left foot. I asked him to take a slow breath and notice the faint, acrid smell of spilled gasoline drifting up through the metal drainage grates from the vehicles parked on the floor beneath us. I directed his vacant stare toward the mesmerizing way the muted, spinning red lights from a distant traffic signal were catching and fracturing in the oily, trembling puddles gathering around the heels of his ruined leather shoes. I continuously fed him these tiny, insignificant fragments of reality, carefully stripping away the overwhelming, suffocating vastness of his internal nightmare and replacing it with the simple, manageable mechanics of the present second. The cold was beginning to set in with a vicious intensity. I could plainly see the severe, uncontrollable tremors violently shaking his entire frame. His knuckles were bone-white against the dark metal of the fence, the skin pulled dangerously taut. He was rapidly losing his physical grip, which meant he was only moments away from losing his psychological tether. I knew I had to offer him something tangible, something solid to anchor his spiraling mind. I slowly stood up, closing half the remaining distance between us, moving with deliberate, predictable slowness. I raised my right hand and firmly grasped the heavy, textured silver thimble ring resting on my index finger. I pulled it off. The metal was still faintly warm from my own body heat. I extended my open palm toward him in the driving rain, offering the only piece of armor I possessed. I told him to take it. I instructed him to press his thumb fiercely into the tiny, rough dimples carved deep into the silver surface. I looked directly into his shadowed, hollow, desperately tired eyes and delivered the single, unwavering phrase that anchored the core of my entire practice. I told him to squeeze the metal and to borrow my voice until his own voice came back to him. He froze, suspended entirely between the pull of the dark drop and the strange, quiet offering of my outstretched hand. Then, agonizingly slowly, one trembling, soaking wet hand released its death grip on the chain-link fence and reached backward toward the solid ground. His cold, stiff fingers brushed against mine as he took the small silver ring. He closed his fist around it, squeezing it with a desperate, terrifying strength, as if the tiny piece of metal could single-handedly defy gravity. We remained exactly like that, locked together in the punishing storm, for well over an hour. I kept a continuous, unbroken stream of calm, steady words flowing between us, weaving a relentless verbal tether, while he gripped my ring like it was the very last solid object remaining in the entire universe. Finally, just as the distant, muted gray light of early dawn began to bleed into the edges of the stormy sky, the violent, rigid tension in his shoulders suddenly shattered. He sagged heavily against the fence, expelling a single, guttural sob of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. Slowly, clumsily, he climbed backward over the thick concrete barrier, his legs giving out the moment his feet hit the safe side of the deck. He collapsed heavily onto the wet cement, his head dropping deeply into his hands as the surviving adrenaline left his system. The medical response team immediately rushed up the concrete ramp, wrapping his shivering body in thick, foil-lined thermal blankets and gently guiding him toward the warmth of the waiting ambulance. Just before he stepped up into the bright, blindingly clinical light of the vehicle, he stopped walking. He turned around, pulling away from the paramedics, and walked slowly back to where I was standing near the edge of the roof. He did not speak a single word. He simply reached out his trembling hand and firmly pressed the silver thimble ring back into my freezing palm. I slipped it immediately back onto my finger, the metal now carrying the biting, shocking chill of the rain. I never asked for his name, and he never offered it. In the gritty reality of crisis intervention, absolute anonymity is a sacred, necessary shield to protect the fiercely vulnerable. The official incident report I filed back at the office later that morning was immediately classified, heavily redacted, and permanently sealed by the agency directors. It was a strict, mandatory protocol enacted whenever a field unit interacted with an individual possessing a highly sensitive, deeply influential public identity. I was completely locked out of any subsequent follow-up procedures or medical updates. I simply walked away from the shift with the absolute, unshakable knowledge that I had successfully helped a complete stranger survive the absolute darkest, most terrifying night of his entire existence. I returned to my quiet, unglamorous apartment, washed the smell of rain and gasoline from my hair, and assumed with absolute certainty that I would never, ever cross paths with that broken man again. I never could have imagined, not in my wildest, most chaotic dreams, that the desperately fractured man I had painstakingly coaxed down from that rain-swept concrete ledge was Reid Ashford. And as I stood alone in the suffocatingly perfect, heavily perfumed air of my sister's wedding, watching him stare at me from across the room, I certainly never anticipated that this grand, meticulously fabricated stage would become the exact location where that buried, desperate ghost from the past would violently and irrevocably resurrect itself. The morning of the ceremony operated with the ruthless, terrifying efficiency of a high-stakes military deployment. The expansive bridal suite located on the second floor of the estate was a chaotic hurricane of toxic hairspray fumes, frantic event coordinators shouting into wireless headsets, and endless yards of steaming white silk. I was ignored for hours, treated as entirely invisible until I was abruptly summoned exactly one time. The lead media director, a perpetually stressed man wearing a tight black turtleneck, rapidly positioned the core family members near a towering, expensive floral arch composed entirely of rare imported orchids. He gestured sharply for me to stand on the absolute farthest edge of the group. As soon as the heavy camera shutter clicked a single, solitary time, a young media assistant gently but firmly touched my elbow, asking me to step out of the frame entirely. The assistant offered a practiced, hollow smile, explaining loudly that the visual balance was simply off, and the digital editing team would have a much easier time handling the final composition without my dark blue dress breaking the carefully planned pastel color palette. I complied silently, stepping backward onto the cold marble sidelines, watching my family instantly close the physical gap I left behind as if I had never existed at all. Just before the massive wooden doors were opened to corral us toward the main reception hall, Monica pulled me roughly aside into a dimly lit alcove. She did not ask how I was feeling or if the long drive had exhausted me. Instead, her cold, calculating eyes aggressively raked over my entire appearance, traveling slowly from my simple hairline down to my plain leather pumps. She scrutinized the modest, unadorned cut of my navy dress, hunting diligently for any unauthorized shine, any flashy jewelry, or any bright embellishment that might steal a fraction of a second of attention. Finding absolutely nothing offensive, a sharp, deeply satisfied nod jerked her chin. I was sufficiently plain. I was appropriately muted. I possessed absolutely no risk of drawing the wealthy eyes away from Sloane. That deliberate, calculated marginalization throughout the early morning laid the solid groundwork for the public cruelty that followed. When Sloane finally stood before the 120 assembled guests and casually weaponized my deeply traumatic profession for a cheap, echoing laugh, she fully expected me to physically shrink. She anticipated a deeply flushed face, a humiliated downward gaze, or perhaps a pathetic, hasty retreat to the staff restrooms. But I gave her absolutely nothing. I stood firmly rooted to the polished floor, my facial expression carved from solid stone. I did not shed a single tear, nor did I open my mouth to offer a weak, stammering defense. My absolute, unyielding stillness magnified the sheer viciousness of her joke tenfold. By completely refusing to play the role of the embarrassed, unstable victim, I forced the entire room to sit uncomfortably with the bitter, toxic taste of her spoken words. The forced, polite chuckles died a rapid, agonizing death, replaced by a suffocating, heavy tension that coated the grand room. That oppressive, heavy silence was abruptly and violently shattered by the hired orchestra. They launched suddenly into a sweeping, booming classical arrangement utilizing heavy brass and aggressive strings, meant to signal the mandatory transition to the formal seating phase. The sudden, deafening surge of loud music, combined with the chaotic, uncoordinated shifting of over 100 bodies moving simultaneously toward the narrow aisles, created a massive wave of sensory friction. Off to my right, standing dangerously close to a massive wooden speaker column, my 16-year-old cousin began to rapidly unravel. I saw the terrifying physiological signs before anyone else in the room even registered a problem. His thin shoulders hiked violently up toward his ears. His chest began to heave in shallow, rapid, staccato jerks, desperately fighting for oxygen in the heavily perfumed air. The overwhelming auditory noise and the terrifying, pressing proximity of the wealthy crowd had triggered a massive, uncontrollable nervous system override. He stumbled backward blindly, his spine hitting a thick glass pane with a dull thud, his hands cramping violently inward into stiff, rigid, unnatural claws. His eyes were completely wide, darting frantically around the room, totally engulfed in pure, blind terror. The polished, elegantly dressed guests standing immediately around him instinctively recoiled in horror, their perfectly contoured faces twisting in deep confusion and visible distaste, treating his severe panic attack as if it were a highly contagious, vulgar disease. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. The glittering society wedding completely vanished from my peripheral vision, replaced instantly by the stark, hyper-focused reality of my daily field operations. I closed the distance between us in 3 rapid, commanding strides. I dropped heavily to my bare knees, right on the pristine, expensive white floor runner, completely ignoring the loud, horrified gasp of a nearby bridesmaid whose silk dress I had brushed past. I reached out and firmly grabbed his rigid, shaking shoulders, physically using my own body to block his view of the staring, whispering crowd. I kept my voice incredibly low, perfectly utilizing the exact calibrated, soothing pitch I routinely used on high-wind ledges and highway bridges. I gently but forcefully pried his stiff, trembling fingers apart. I pulled the heavy silver thimble ring from my right hand and pressed the cold metal firmly into his sweaty, shaking palm. I looked directly into his panicked, dilated eyes, cutting entirely through the chaotic, booming noise of the reception hall, and delivered the grounding command with absolute, unwavering professional authority. I told him to squeeze the metal and to borrow my voice until his own voice came back. I repeated the specific phrase a second time, deliberately pacing my own deep breathing so his erratic lungs could subconsciously mirror the rhythm. Slowly, agonizingly, the terrifying, ironclad tension in his chest began to fracture and release. But the true, earth-shattering impact of my spoken words did not land solely on the frightened teenage boy. Less than 10 feet away, standing just behind the final row of imported velvet guest chairs, Reid froze completely solid. He had been casually turning his body to speak to his lead groomsman, but the distinct, rhythmic cadence of my emergency instruction drifted cleanly over the velvet ropes and struck him directly in the center of his chest. He whipped his head around so fast it looked painful. All the warm, healthy color violently and instantly drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly ashen pallor. His jaw went entirely slack. He stared intensely at me kneeling on the floor, watching me hold the textured silver ring inside the boy's trembling hand. He was no longer standing inside a sunlit, luxurious conservatory surrounded by wealth and music. His mind had been forcefully dragged backward through time, violently deposited onto a freezing, rain-swept concrete roof in the dead of night, up on the elevated marble platform. Sloane had been furiously watching her perfectly curated timeline veer wildly off its designated course. She saw the boy collapse against the glass. She saw me instantly intervene and take total command of the space, but far more importantly, she saw the absolute paralyzing shock completely overtaking her future husband. Her manicured hands gripped her expensive bridal bouquet tight enough to audibly snap the green stems. She did not know what the hidden connection was. She did not know the history of the silver ring or the weight of the spoken phrase, but as she watched Reid stare at me with those haunted, fully recognizing eyes, she finally realized with cold dread that a massive, invisible thread had just snapped. The pristine, highly controlled narrative she had spent years building was violently and undeniably slipping completely out of her manicured hands. The immediate aftermath of the medical emergency left a strange, vibrating energy in the room. The string quartet resumed playing, desperately attempting to smooth over the disruption, but the polished social veneer had cracked. Reid did not return to his designated spot near the elevated altar. Instead, he abruptly bypassed the smiling event coordinators and caught Sloane by the elbow, steering her firmly away from the crowded floor and into a quiet, shadowed corridor lined with heavy velvet drapes. I watched them from a distance. Standing near the towering glass walls of the conservatory, I could not hear their specific words, but the rigid angles of Reid's posture spoke volumes. He was a man actively dismantling a lie. According to the strict event timeline, they were supposed to be taking their final individual portraits. Instead, Reid cornered his bride. He demanded to know, with cold, unyielding directness, exactly why I was completely absent from the bridal party. He asked why my assigned seat was hidden behind the catering doors, completely isolated from the family tables. He pointed out the glaring inconsistency of her previous claims. He bluntly stated that the woman who had just expertly stabilized a severe medical crisis with absolute surgical precision did not look remotely like the dangerously unstable liability Sloane had spent months describing to his family. Sloane offered her perfectly rehearsed counterattack. Her voice, carrying faintly down the marble hallway, maintained its sweet, musical pitch, but the edges were undeniably sharp and defensive. She repeated the exact same toxic script she had fed to everyone else. She claimed I was deeply unpredictable. She insisted my emotional state was fragile and prone to extreme, sudden shifts. She argued that my mere presence had a tendency to make every social situation unbearably heavy. But this time, Reid was actually listening to the mechanics of her speech. He was no longer a compliant audience member accepting a tragic family anecdote. He heard the aggressive, over-rehearsed cadence of her defense. He noticed the complete absence of any genuine, sisterly concern in her eyes. It was not a protective warning. It was a carefully constructed public relations strategy designed to neutralize a threat to her image. Reid turned away from her mid-sentence. His jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle ticked visibly beneath his skin. He stepped back into the main reception area and was immediately intercepted by his best man, Miles Carver. Miles was a sharp, fiercely observant corporate litigator who missed absolutely nothing in a room. He leaned in close to Reid, his voice a low, gravelly murmur designed to cut through the ambient noise without traveling further than necessary. Miles noted quietly that the narrative simply did not match the physical evidence. He pointed out that the woman who had just dropped to the floor absorbed a massive wave of panic and brought a hyperventilating teenager back to reality in under 60 seconds was the absolute antithesis of someone out of control. Miles observed that I was, without question, the most composed, highly regulated individual in the entire building. The stark contrast between Sloane's vicious warnings and my undeniable competence was a glaring red flag that could no longer be ignored by either of them. Reid abandoned his groomsmen and began walking with singular purpose. The lead wedding coordinator tried to intercept him, frantically tapping a silver pen against her clipboard to remind him of the schedule, but he walked right past her as if she were made of air. He navigated through the sea of wealthy guests, his eyes locked entirely on me. I had retreated to the humid, quiet sanctuary of the indoor greenhouse attached to the side of the hall. The air inside was thick and deeply earthy, smelling of damp soil and crushed fern leaves. It was a sharp, necessary contrast to the suffocating perfume and hairspray of the main venue. I stood alone beside a massive, broad-leafed plant, taking slow, deliberate breaths to clear the residual adrenaline from the earlier crisis intervention. The heavy glass door swung open. Reid stepped into the humid enclosure, the door clicking shut behind him, instantly sealing us off from the booming orchestra and the murmuring crowd. The acoustic shift was dramatic. Suddenly, the only sound was the faint, rhythmic dripping of the automated irrigation system overhead. He stopped 5 feet away from me. The pristine, confident groom who had been shaking hands and smiling politely an hour ago was completely gone. The man standing in front of me looked haunted, his breathing shallow, his eyes wide and dark with a terrifying realization. He did not offer a polite greeting. He did not mention the incident with my teenage cousin. He stared directly into my face and asked a single, incredibly heavy question. "You were at Briar Square on a rainy night in November, were you not?" The question hung in the damp air, carrying the weight of a physical blow. I did not immediately answer. Instead, I looked at him closely, stripping away the expensive tailored suit and the polished grooming. I looked for the broken man standing on the freezing concrete ledge. As my eyes dropped to his hands resting rigidly at his sides, I noticed the faint, thin white scar running parallel to the tendons on his left wrist. It was a stark, permanent testament to a pain he had barely survived. Then, I watched the rise and fall of his chest. He inhaled sharply, but at the very end of his exhale, he held the breath for a tiny, specific fraction of a second before inhaling again. It was a highly specialized, deliberate breathing technique designed to forcefully slow a racing heart rate and prevent a panic spiral. It was the exact technique I had relentlessly drilled into him for over an hour during that catastrophic storm. We did not need a long, dramatic explanation. We did not need to recount the agonizing minutes, the freezing rain, or the desperate fear. The absolute confirmation passed between us in a profound, heavy silence. I slowly lifted my right hand, allowing the muted light filtering through the glass roof to catch the textured surface of the silver thimble ring. I met his gaze, my expression perfectly calm, completely validating the memory he had just unearthed. The phrase about borrowing my voice, the silver ring, the unyielding patience in the dark, it all locked together with terrifying clarity. Reid went entirely still. The sheer, overwhelming gravity of the truth crashed into him, visible in the way his shoulders abruptly dropped. He realized, with sickening certainty, that the quiet, unsmiling woman his fiancée had just publicly humiliated for her own amusement was the exact same woman who had absorbed his deepest agony and literally kept him tethered to the living world. He realized he was about to marry a person who viewed my capacity for profound human compassion as a pathetic, laughable weakness. The foundation of his entire relationship violently fractured beneath his feet. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. The muffled sound of Sloane's voice calling his name filtered through the heavy glass walls from the reception hall. The wedding machinery was relentlessly demanding his return. Reid took one slow step backward, his eyes never leaving mine, his face hardened, the shock morphing into a cold, terrifying resolve. He was no longer a man preparing for a celebration. He was a man preparing for a demolition. Before he turned to open the door, he spoke one final time. His voice was low, rough, and completely stripped of any polite societal pretense. "Do not leave. I need to hear the entire truth before I walk down that aisle." I did not wait for the harried wedding coordinator to blow her silver whistle and herd us toward the main sanctuary doors. I moved through the lingering, perfumed crowd with a singular, unyielding purpose. I found Gerald and Monica holding court near a towering, absurdly expensive champagne fountain. Their faces locked in those terrible, frozen smiles of false aristocratic nobility. I did not ask for their precious time politely. I stepped directly into their line of sight, grabbed my mother tightly by the elbow of her custom silk sleeve, and told them both to follow me immediately. I did not leave any room for debate or polite refusal. I turned and walked straight toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the secluded back terrace of Merewood Hall. The air outside was sharp and cold, biting fiercely through the thin fabric of my dark dress, but the physical chill was absolutely nothing compared to the freezing, solid anger anchoring my chest. I stopped near the heavy stone balustrade, turning to face them as the heavy glass doors clicked shut behind us, cutting off the swelling sound of the string orchestra. For the very first time in over a decade, I did not filter my words. I did not attempt to soften my tone, swallow my pride, or protect their incredibly fragile manufactured egos. I stared directly into my mother's heavily powdered face and demanded to know exactly what narrative she had spun. I asked her, point blank, what specific, calculated lies she had fed to the Ashford family regarding my life, my career, and my mental state. Gerald immediately puffed out his chest, stepping forward in a pathetic, transparent attempt to assert his patriarchal authority. He aggressively adjusted his expensive imported tie, shooting a nervous, panicked glance back toward the glass doors to ensure no important financial donors had followed us onto the terrace. He deployed his classic, dismissive tactic. He told me to lower my voice immediately. He firmly stated that today was not my day, that I was being deeply selfish, and that I was actively trying to ruin my sister's perfect, flawless moment out of sheer, bitter jealousy. He pointed a trembling finger toward the building and ordered me to go back inside, find my hidden table, and sit quietly until the entire reception ended. But I did not look at him. I kept my eyes locked entirely onto Monica. I stepped 1 inch closer, refusing to back down, the silence between us turning into a heavy, suffocating vacuum. The immense pressure finally snapped her carefully manicured patience. Monica let out an exasperated, harsh breath. Her perfectly contoured face twisted into an ugly, sneering mask of sheer annoyance. She admitted it. She told me she had personally sat down with Eleanor Ashford and informed her that I suffered from severe, unpredictable emotional instability. She confessed to labeling my grueling, life-saving medical career as a temporary, desperate phase, a reckless cry for attention from a deeply unbalanced mind. She claimed, with terrifying self-righteousness, that she had advised the Groom family it was simply best to keep me entirely out of the spotlight to prevent me from suffering a public, embarrassing psychological breakdown during the festivities. I listened to her toxic, venomous words fall from her lips with terrifying, practiced ease. I did not yell. The raw truth was far more devastating than any screaming match could ever be. I told her plainly that she did not invent those vicious lies out of a misguided sense of maternal protection or genuine worry for my well-being. I stripped away her pathetic, noble justification right there on the cold stone terrace. I told her she fabricated that exact story because my actual, gritty reality terrified her. My existence as a woman who dealt with real, raw, bleeding human trauma was a massive, undeniable threat to the pristine, flawless aristocratic picture Sloane had so desperately constructed to buy her way into this family. They had weaponized the very concept of mental illness to medically quarantine me from their newly acquired wealthy circle. They had turned my profound, hard-earned empathy into a clinical defect just so Sloane could secure her enormous financial prize without having to answer any awkward questions about her bankrupt past. A sharp sudden sound of expensive leather stepping onto dry leaves completely shattered the tense air. From the deep, creeping shadows of the heavy stone archway to our left, a figure emerged. It was Eleanor Ashford. The formidable matriarch had stepped outside for a moment of quiet air long before we arrived and had been standing merely 10 feet away, completely concealed by the thick ivy. She had heard every single syllable of my mother's vile, calculating confession. Eleanor's face was entirely devoid of its usual polite, societal warmth. Her expression was carved from absolute, unforgiving ice. Her sharp, calculating eyes locked directly onto Monica, dissecting my mother right down to her hollow, ambitious core. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She did not need to shout to command the space. Her words carried the crushing, undeniable weight of a titan passing absolute moral judgment. She slowly walked forward and informed my parents that her profound horror did not merely stem from the simple fact that they had lied to her family about their wealth or their background. Her absolute disgust was rooted in the specific, cruel weapon they had chosen to wield. Eleanor revealed, with a terrifying, steady calmness that made the air feel heavy, that the immense Ashford fortune funded a massive philanthropic trust dedicated exclusively to acute crisis intervention and psychiatric care. She explained, her voice cracking for a fraction of a second, that over 10 years ago, the Ashford family had lost their eldest son to a sudden, fatal mental health crisis. They had lost him precisely because the family had ignored the quiet warning signs, blinded by the exact same toxic, upper-class social stigma that Monica had just casually deployed as a cheap manipulation tactic to secure a wedding. I watched all the blood violently and instantly drain from my mother's face. Her meticulously applied makeup suddenly looked like cheap, flaky paint slathered over a terrified ghost. Gerald took a staggering, clumsy step backward, physically recoiling from the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic mistake they had made. They realized simultaneously that their calculated lie was not just incredibly cruel to me, it was an unforgivable, deeply offensive insult to the absolute darkest tragedy the Ashford family had ever endured. Monica opened her mouth, a pathetic, stammering, breathless sound escaping her throat as she desperately tried to formulate an apology, to furiously backpedal, to somehow put the shattered pieces of their lucrative social scheme back together. But there were absolutely no words capable of fixing a wound that deep. She had just single-handedly detonated her favorite daughter's entire future. Right at that exact second, the heavy glass doors burst open with a violent crash. Sloane rushed out onto the terrace, her heavy designer silk gown rustling aggressively against the rough stone floor. She was entirely frantic, breathing heavily, completely unaware of the highly radioactive fallout she had just walked right into. She had been furiously searching for her parents because the formal procession was strictly scheduled to begin in less than 5 minutes. She saw my face, saw the utter, paralyzing devastation painted across our parents' faces, and her meticulously managed bridal composure violently snapped. She completely misread the room. She foolishly assumed I had simply insulted them or complained about my seating arrangement again, trying to steal her thunder. Sloane glared at me, her eyes flashing with pure, unfiltered, childish hatred. She lost complete control of her carefully crafted, elegant persona. Her voice rose into a harsh, shrill shriek that echoed terribly off the stone walls and out into the manicured gardens. She screamed that I was completely pathetic, that I was a miserable, jealous failure who was always trying to ruin everything beautiful and perfect in her life. And then, entirely unable to stop her own venomous, crashing momentum, she spat out the final, condemning sentence. She pointed a shaking finger at my chest and told me I was nothing but a miserable leech, shouting that I only ever had any actual value when someone else was actively breaking apart. The echoing silence that followed her vicious, screaming outburst was absolute and terrifying. Sloane stood there, breathing heavily, her chest heaving, feeling a brief, triumphant surge of cruel satisfaction at having finally said the quiet part out loud. But that dark satisfaction evaporated the very instant she noticed where my eyes were looking. I was not looking at her. I was looking directly over her bare shoulder. Sloane slowly, hesitantly, turned her head toward the open glass doors. Reid was standing right there. He was positioned perfectly within the heavy wooden door frame, his hands resting rigidly by his sides. He had stepped out onto the terrace just in time to hear the woman he was supposed to marry enthusiastically and viciously degrade the exact same human compassion that had literally saved his life on that freezing concrete roof. His handsome face was entirely unreadable, a terrifying, absolute blank slate that promised nothing but complete and utter destruction. The massive, intricate machinery of a high society event possesses a terrifying, unstoppable momentum. Despite the absolute, earth-shattering devastation that had just occurred out on the freezing stone terrace, the elaborate production simply ground its gears and forced everything relentlessly forward. The strict timeline was treated as a sacred text, entirely immune to the messy reality of human suffering or suddenly shattered illusions. I slipped back inside the grand hall, just as the heavy brass doors of the main sanctuary were being pulled open by the uniformed catering staff. I bypassed the designated family pews entirely. I had no desire to sit anywhere near the epicenter of the impending disaster. I chose instead to drop heavily into a rigid wooden chair situated on the absolute furthest edge of the very last row. My strategy was incredibly simple and entirely final. I would sit quietly in the dark shadows for the duration of the 45-minute ceremony, and the very second the officiant pronounced the final blessing, I would stand up, walk directly out the back exit, retrieve my vehicle from the valet, and drive away from this toxic, suffocating theater forever. I firmly resolved not to be the cause or the victim of any further dramatic spectacle. The towering pipe organ groaned to life, sending a deep, vibrating chord straight through the polished marble floorboards. The heavy wooden doors at the front of the hall swung wide, and Sloane stepped into the central aisle. She gripped our father arm with a terrifying, white-knuckled intensity. Gerald looked utterly hollowed out, resembling a condemned man marching toward a corporate execution, but Sloane was radiating a desperate, manic, blinding energy. Her custom designer silk gown cascaded around her like a thick suit of protective armor. She wore a smile so fiercely rehearsed, so aggressively bright and wide, that it looked physically painful for her facial muscles to maintain. She was operating on sheer, sociopathic willpower. I could see the frantic, singular calculation burning intensely behind her eyes. She genuinely believed that if she could simply march down that long aisle, force the officiant to read the legally binding script, and secure the heavy diamond ring onto her left hand, she would permanently win the war. She arrogantly assumed the sheer weight of the public spectacle would somehow magically erase the catastrophic revelations Reid had just witnessed on the terrace. The atmosphere inside the vaulted sanctuary was incredibly thick. Stretched so taut it felt completely surreal and entirely devoid of oxygen. The 120 wealthy guests settled into a hushed, respectful silence, the rustling of expensive fabrics dying down as their eyes fixed entirely on the glowing couple standing beneath the soaring, imported floral archway. The hired string quartet faded out their tents. Trembling notes. The officiant, a distinguished man possessing silver hair and a deeply resonant, theatrical voice, stepped up to the carved wooden podium. He began reading the standard, poetic introduction regarding the sacred nature of honesty, the necessity of unbreakable trust, and the profound importance of building a marital foundation upon absolute, unvarnished truth. Every single syllable he spoke echoed through the cavernous room with a sickening, heavy irony that made my stomach twist violently. I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the intricate stained glass window high above the altar, actively counting the passing seconds, mentally calculating the exact physical distance between my chair and the closest exit door. Eventually, the officiant finished his sweeping opening remarks and smoothly transitioned to the exchange of personal vows. A soft, expectant murmur rippled through the seated crowd. Sloane eagerly handed her elaborate cascading bouquet to her terrified-looking maid of honor. She reached into the hidden folds of her gown and retrieved a piece of thick, textured ivory paper. She unfolded it with trembling, eager fingers, fully prepared to deliver a meticulously crafted, utterly fictional monologue detailing her deep, soulful, and entirely fabricated emotional connection to the man standing across from her. But Reid did not move a single muscle. He stood perfectly still, looking at his bride with a cold, analytical detachment that was deeply unsettling to witness. He held a small, sealed cream envelope in his left hand, presumably containing his own prepared promises. He stared down at the thick paper for a long, heavy, agonizing moment. Then, with slow, deliberate precision that sent a shockwave of confusion through the front rows, he slipped the unopened envelope directly into the inner pocket of his dark suit jacket. He let his empty hands fall loosely to his sides. The entire room collectively held its breath. The silence suddenly felt heavy enough to crush bone. Sloane's perfect smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A tiny, visible tremor of genuine panic finally breaking through her porcelain facade. The officiant leaned forward over the podium, his brow furrowed in polite confusion, opening his mouth to gently prompt the groom to proceed with the schedule. Reid raised his right hand, a sharp, commanding gesture that instantly and completely silenced the older man. Reid politely asked the officiant for a single minute of grace. He did not wait for an answer or permission. He turned his body away from Sloane entirely and stepped right up to the very edge of the elevated marble platform. He looked directly out at the vast sea of wealthy, expectant faces filling the velvet pews. His facial expression was terrifyingly calm. It was the absolute, focused stillness of a man who had completely bypassed rage, skipped over sorrow, and landed squarely in the realm of cold, righteous execution. He did not request a microphone, but his voice carried perfectly through the silent sanctuary, striking the stone walls with a heavy, undeniable weight. He told the gathered crowd that before he could ever make any promises regarding his future, he first needed to confess the absolute truth regarding his past. He began to describe a specific night, over 2 years ago. He painted a stark, vivid, unflinching picture of a broken man standing on the freezing, rain-slicked edge of a concrete parking structure, utterly consumed by a darkness so profound and agonizing that he had firmly decided to end his own life right there in the storm. The guests sat completely frozen, absolutely captivated and deeply horrified by the raw, bleeding vulnerability suddenly pouring from the notoriously private air of the Ashford Empire. Reid described the howling wind cutting through his clothes, the blinding rain, and the total, crushing weight of his despair. Then, Reid shifted the narrative. He told them about a stranger. He spoke of a woman who had walked out of the freezing storm and deliberately sat down on the wet concrete right beside him. He detailed how she had stubbornly refused to leave him alone in the dark, how she had patiently, relentlessly anchored his fractured mind back to the living world using nothing but the quiet, steady cadence of her voice and the physical weight of a simple piece of metal pressed into his palm. He described how she had absorbed his absolute terror without offering a single ounce of judgment or pity, physically pulling him back from the absolute brink of destruction. Up on the altar, behind his back, Sloane's rigid posture dramatically shifted. I watched her perfectly painted face morph from initial, terrifying panic into a strange, twisted expression of profound relief and arrogant triumph. She was completely, utterly misunderstanding the entire moment. She genuinely believed Reid was using this dramatic, deeply traumatic public confession to eventually elevate her. She thought he was about to publicly credit her unwavering love and incredible support for healing his broken mind, effectively turning her into the ultimate noble savior of the Ashford bloodline in front of all his wealthy peers. She even took a small, confident step forward, her chest puffed out slightly, entirely ready to graciously accept the incoming wave of awe, admiration, and applause from the captivated audience. Reid paused his story. He let the heavy, emotional weight of his incredible survival settle completely over the silent room. He turned his head slowly, his cold gaze sweeping across the front row where his mother sat completely rigid, moving past the absolutely terrified, bloodless faces of my parents, and finally locking directly onto Sloane. She beamed back at him, a radiant, expectant victor eagerly waiting to be crowned. Reid looked at her with a profound, bone-chilling emptiness that stripped away every single lie she had ever told. The silence in the sanctuary stretched until it felt like the massive stained glass windows might shatter inward from the sheer atmospheric pressure. He delivered the final, devastating blow with a voice so clear and sharp it cut through the heavy air like a guillotine blade dropping in the town square. That woman was not Sloane. The echo of his final sentence hung in the vaulted air of the sanctuary, a devastating truth that completely paralyzed the room. Reid did not give Sloane a single second to recover or spin a new web of lies. He turned his gaze away from her horrified face and looked directly past the velvet pews, straight into the dim shadows of the back row where I was sitting. He raised his hand and pointed right at me. He commanded me to stand up. The sheer authority in his voice left me no room to hide. I slowly rose from my wooden chair, the fabric of my dark dress rustling loudly in the absolute, terrifying silence. Reid addressed the 120 wealthy guests, his voice ringing with a fierce, unwavering clarity. He introduced me properly to the crowd. He told them that I was not a chaotic liability to be hidden away, but the dedicated crisis intervention specialist who had physically held him back from the freezing edge of a concrete drop exactly 2 years ago. To ensure no one in that room could possibly dismiss his confession as a sudden stress-induced delusion or a dramatic exaggeration. Reid repeated the exact phrase that had anchored him to the living world. He looked right into my eyes across the vast distance and said the words aloud. He told them how I had handed him a piece of battered silver and instructed him to borrow my voice until his own voice came back. Hearing my own professional directives spoken back to me in this opulent, suffocating cathedral of lies felt like a lightning strike. The crowd collectively gasped. The sheer, intimate specificity of that sentence instantly eradicated any lingering doubt. It was the undeniable, concrete proof of our shared history, exposing the profound depth of my reality against the shallow, fragile veneer of my sister's manufactured world. Reid slowly pivoted back to face the woman he had almost married. Sloane was trembling violently, her expensive designer gown shaking around her legs like fragile paper. He asked her a series of sharp, agonizing questions that offered absolutely no route for escape. He demanded to know exactly why she had painstakingly fabricated a story about my mental instability to his family. He asked how she could possibly justify taking a microphone just an hour earlier to publicly mock the exact same profession that had kept her future husband breathing. He dissected her cruelty with surgical precision, forcing her to stand fully exposed under the harsh, unforgiving light of her own malice. There was no answer from the bride. She simply opened and closed her mouth, desperately searching for a public relations spin that did not exist. The crushing silence from the altar immediately transferred the heavy, judgmental weight of the room onto the front row. Gerald and Monica were completely trapped. They had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide their profound shame. They sat rigidly in their front row seats, physically shrinking under the sudden, burning glare of the Ashford family. Their direct complicity in the toxic slander was glaringly obvious. The terrified, bloodless expressions frozen on my parents' faces served as a far more damning confession than any spoken apology ever could. The wealthy, influential peers they had spent years trying to impress were now looking at them with unadulterated, absolute disgust. Reid did not raise his voice to a scream. He did not need to resort to cheap theatrics to completely dismantle the union. He simply stated his boundaries with the cold, immovable weight of a man who fully understood the value of his own life. He told Sloane directly that he could never align his future with a person who viewed human compassion and desperate vulnerability as a shameful social defect. He declared, with absolute finality, that he flatly refused to enter into a marriage with a family that aggressively weaponized mental health struggles as a calculated tool to manipulate their own social standing. He reached into his tailored pocket and pulled out the heavy, flawless gold band he was supposed to place on her finger. He did not throw it. He stepped over to the wooden podium and deliberately, heavily set the ring down right on top of the officiant's open ceremonial book. The metallic clink sounded like a heavy vault door slamming shut forever. Reid looked at the stunned officiant and ordered him to halt the proceedings immediately. In one swift, undeniable motion, he transformed a multi-million-dollar aristocratic wedding into a bare, unforgiving stage where only the absolute truth was allowed to remain standing. That was the exact moment Sloane completely shattered. The flawless, perfectly curated mask of the blushing, elegant bride violently ripped apart. She lost all sense of decorum, logic, or self-preservation. She let out a harsh, ugly scream that echoed terribly off the stained glass windows. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at me across the massive room and shrieked that I had ruined absolutely everything for her again. It was a vile, childish, utterly pathetic outburst. And it was the final, fatal nail in her coffin. By instantly blaming me for the destruction caused entirely by her own sociopathic lies, she permanently locked in her true image for every single guest who might have harbored a tiny fraction of residual sympathy for her. She proved Reid entirely right. I did not step forward to claim any sort of dramatic victory. I did not walk down the center aisle to demand apologies or drag my sister further through the mud. I had absolutely no desire to rescue the ruined ceremony or participate in their messy public autopsy. I simply smoothed the front of my dark blue dress, squared my shoulders, and turned my back on the entire spectacle. I walked toward the heavy oak exit doors with my spine perfectly straight, leaving the chaos, the screaming, and the shattered illusions entirely behind me. I was barely halfway down the exterior stone steps, breathing in the sharp, clean, freezing air of the afternoon, when I heard the heavy doors open and close behind me. It was Eleanor Ashford. She had not followed me to beg for forgiveness on behalf of my family or to offer empty social platitudes. She matched my stride, her posture radiating an intense, formidable business acumen. She spoke with crisp, undeniable authority. She informed me that the Ashford Renewal Trust was currently looking to heavily expand their philanthropic footprint. She explicitly stated that they intended to fully fund a massive, state-of-the-art mobile crisis response unit for Blue Haven. And she made it absolutely clear that this massive financial grant was entirely contingent upon me accepting the position of lead clinical director to oversee the operation. She offered me the exact power and resources I needed to save countless more lives, validating my worth in a currency my family could never even comprehend. The true resolution of that day did not arrive with screaming matches or tearful, dramatic reconciliations. I did not wait around in the cold parking lot for Gerald and Monica to stumble out and offer me a pathetic, delayed fraction of the parental love they had actively withheld for decades. I knew with absolute certainty that any apology they could muster would be entirely hollow, driven solely by their own catastrophic social ruin rather than genuine remorse. I refused to accept their toxic, conditional affection any longer. My ultimate permanent revenge was not the destruction of Sloane's wedding, it was the profound, quiet liberation of my own soul. For the very first time in my entire existence, I drove away from my blood relatives feeling entirely whole. I stepped out of their twisted, suffocating shadow, finally realizing that I no longer needed a single ounce of their validation to know exactly how much my life mattered. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment telling me where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Daisy Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support it further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.